Hi everyone. Last week we learned about functions. So, how to define a function, how to invoke or call a function, how to pass values if you have anything like one, two, or more values to a function, and if you have a value returning function, how you can get something back from it. We learned about non-value returning function versus value returning function. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about keyword versus positional arguments. So far, we only used a fixed number of positional arguments when we were dealing with functions. So simply, a positional argument is an argument that is assigned to particular parameters based on its position in the argument list. Okay, so if you have a function, this is like a function definition. If you have a function that is called mortgage rate, then let's say you have three different parameters: amount, rate, and term. You can use the positional argument, and that is what we have used so far to assign different values to those parameters. Okay, so when you have a function call, which I'm doing it here in this line, you are passing three values, and based on their position you're assigning them to different parameters. So the first one goes to the first parameter, the second one goes to the second parameter, and the third one goes to the third parameter. So this is one way of assigning different values to the parameters of a function. There are other ways that you can do it, and that is the other way that I'm going to talk about is the keyword arguments. A keyword argument is an argument that is specified by parameter name rather than as a positional argument. So if you know the name of your parameters, you can directly assign values to those parameters name. Okay, so if you have a function mortgage rate and you have three different parameters and you know what you call them, you can assign values to those parameters without and forget about their position. Let's say you wrote a program a year ago and you want to call that function, and you don't remember uh, the positions of different parameters, but you know exactly what you call them. So you can use keyword arguments to assign values to them. All right, so you say, for instance, rate is 0.06, term is 20, amount is $350,000. And then, since you're using keyword arguments, the values are going to be assigned to those parameters based on the keyword that you're using, based on their name rather than their position. So this can be very helpful if it is easier to remember the parameters names than to remember their order. Okay, again, if you have a very huge program and you do not remember the order of your parameters, but you know exactly what you call, like you name them, you can use keyword argument instead of positional arguments. You can also combine the two. You can combine positional and keyword arguments to send different values to your functions. Okay, so if you do not specify the name, then you use positional arguments. So the first one that you have goes to the first value in your function, and then if you have names, then based on the keyword that you're using, you're going to assign values to those parameters. Again, this is helpful if you maybe know only the uh, what you have for the first argument, and then you don't remember the order of the remaining parameters. So you can you can combine positional and keyword argument depending on what function you have, if you remember the order versus if remembering their keyword. Now let's take a look at an example. Let's say I want to write a function that adds up two numbers to each other. So I'm going to define that function and I'm going to call it add up, right? And I'm going to have two parameters. I'm going to call them first and last. So I'm going to end this with a colon, and then inside I'm going to say print first plus last. or I can say to make sure I have the correct value, I can also say print first and comma first and do the similar thing for last, and then the third line is going to add them up to each other, variable last. Alright, so now if I run this program, nothing is going to happen because I'm not calling this function. So now let's call the function. So I'm going to say add up, and as you see, this is a non-value returning function. I'm using it only for its side effects. All right, so since I'm using it for its side effect, I'm like that doesn't make sense to print the return value. If I try to print it, I'm going to get none as a result at the end. Okay, so since this is like a non-value returning function, I'm going to just use it for its side effects. So I'm going to simply call the function. So add up. So now I need to pass some arguments to it. Let's say for now I'm going to use the positional arguments. All right, so I'm going to pass 2 and 5 to that function. So if I run it, I should get the first is 2, last is 5, and then if you add them to each other, you're going to get 7. But now let's say I know what I'm calling them, so I'm going to say assign last the value of 15 and assign first the value of 20. So now I'm assigning, oh, it should be equal sign. So I'm assigning 15 to variable last, and I'm using keyword argument instead of positional argument. So simply this going to be assigned to this variable last, and my second argument is going to be assigned to my first parameter. Okay, so now if I run it, I should get 20 for first and 15 for last because I'm using keyword argument instead of positional argument. So now let's add another parameter here. So I'm going to add middle, so first, middle, and last, and I'm going to also print that here. All right. So let's say middle plus last. So I have all of the stuff that I need. So now I'm going to go to my function call. So let's say I'm going to start over. I know the first value is my first, so I'm going to assign 5 to it. So I'm using positional argument. For the last two, I'm not sure of the order, so I'm going to say last is 4 and then middle is 2. Okay, or let's go with like 10. So I have 5 for my first, which uses positional argument, and then for the remaining argument, I'm using keyword argument. So I'm using their name, their parameter name, and then I'm assigning them a value. So if I run it, I should see 5 for first, I should see 6 for middle, and I should see 10 for last. Let's see. So here you go, 5, 6, and 10. So in this example, you're using a combination of positional and keyword arguments. One thing that you need to be careful is you can combine positional and keyword arguments, but your positional arguments must come first. So you cannot have last 10 and then at the end have this 5. You cannot do that. So the positional argument must come first, and then any keyword argument that you have comes at the end. So it knows it starts from the beginning, assign all of those positions, and then whatever is remained, it use keyword argument to assign those values to their parameters. Another cool feature regarding argument is that you can have a default argument. Okay, similar if you remember range function. With range function, you can either pass one value to it, 2 values, or 3 values, because there are some default values when we are working with range function. So you can set a default value when you're setting your parameters. So in this example, I'm going to say amount, rate, and term, and then inside that, I'm going to put a default value for term. All right. So I'm saying default value for term is 20. So if you do not pass any value, any argument for term, you're going to use its default value. So now let's take a look at our example and make changes and put a default value for one of the parameters. So now in this example, let's put a default value for last. I'm going to put 20 for my last, and then I'm going to say, all right, I'm only passing two arguments to that function. I'm passing 5 and I'm passing middle, all right? And if you pass 2, it will use a default value for last. Actually, let me take this out. So I'm using positional arguments. So 5 is going to be assigned to first, 6 is going to be assigned to middle, and I'm not passing any value for last, so it's going to take its default value. So let's take a look. Here you go. So last is taken its default value. If I pass a value for last, it's going to overwrite the default value and use the value that you just sent to it. When you're working with default value, it becomes a bit tricky if you want to have default value for your first item. So if you have a default value for your first item, for instance, and give it a value like 1, and if you leave that empty, let's say you're only passing one value and you meant to send a 6 for middle. So if you run this, you're going to get an error message or syntax error because you're using positional argument, okay, in this example. So I'm trying to assign 6 to first, and then there is no value for middle. So then that means you're not passing enough arguments to your function. So by default, it's going to not let you to run that program at all. So you need to be careful if you want to have a default value for your first item. So you might need to change the order of your parameters in function definition. But if you have a default value for the remaining last items, there is no issue. You can simply do that. And in the next lecture, I try to create a range function using default value and see if we can replicate that function ourselves.